example, all men are mortal, John is a man, therefore John is mortal. And the other reasoning from which there come graphs and statistics is induction. Induction is from the particular to the general or the universal. Now, one of the reasons why we have to use this particular kind of reason is because we would never know certain conclusions unless we made an investigation. That's one of the reasons we have to have statistics. For example, suppose you wanted to answer such questions as these. Is marmalade stickier than jam? Well, you have to use induction and go around and stick your finger in marmalade and jam. Or this problem. Do babies with blue booties cry louder than babies with pink booties? Which do men prefer, nightshirts or pajamas? That's the question you would have to investigate. You never could find it out by deduction. Now, these inductions can be complete when you investigate all of the cases and all of the samples, or they can be incomplete. There are very few that are actually complete. For example, a mother has 4 children, 3 of them in the room. She says, "Where is Gwendolyn?" As soon as she gets the answer, she has complete induction. She's made an investigation of the location of all of her children. Now, incomplete induction means that you cannot investigate all cases. So you take some samples and investigate a few. From these, you get statistics, you get graphs. I want to tell you about a graph picture that I have hanging in my office, and I have it hanging there in order that I will never take graphs and statistics too seriously. I want you to take a look at it. The title of it is "The Fund for the Poor of the World." And the 12 months are at the top. And the line, the graph, is very, very low. In fact, the fund is low until you get to the month of June. And then in June it skyrockets and then comes down again very low the rest of the year. I am seated at a desk answering a telephone, and I'm saying to someone, looking at the graph, "Let's see now. Last year I was away in June." That's when everything went up. Suppose now we wanted to make some statistical finding about how many youths in America under 21 years of age said their prayers. How could we do it? Well, one method, we might telephone them and say, "Are you saying your prayers?" And then secondly, we might hide a camera in the bedroom and take a picture of them. And thirdly, we might also ask them to keep a diary and write down every time they said their prayers. Suppose now I gave you a statistic. Suppose I investigated the number that said their prayers, or I said that I did, and I gave you this answer. The 12.3% of the youths of America under 21 years of age say their prayers. Now, you'd be very much impressed with that, wouldn't you? Because there's that 3%. And you would say, "My, that must be scientific." That 12.3, that was one of the great advantages, incidentally, of the Ivory Soap advertisement. Ivory Soap, 99 and 44, 100% pure. And you would say to yourself, "My goodness, if Ivory Soap admitted that there's 56 100ths of 1% impurity, that must be good soap." It was the fraction that got you. All right, now suppose I said that, 12.3. Now I'm going to tell you how we might arrive at that conclusion. Suppose I investigated. Cannot investigate all of the youth in America. Suppose I phone 600 of them, from which I got 12.3. Now, I'm going to give you some rules for statistics. And notice how they're going to be worked out. Whenever you hear a statistic, always ask these questions. 1, how many possible cases are there? That is to say, how many cases could be tested? 2, how many were tested? 3, can you believe what they told you? That was the problem Kinzig had. Did everybody tell Kinzig the truth? Not on your life. You can't be sure if you call up the boys and say, did you say your prayers, that they said their prayers? And 4th, if it comes from an independent laboratory, who paid for the experiment? If cigarette X blows much better smoke rings than cigarette Y, who paid for that investigation? The independent laboratory isn't in business with their health, you know. Now, keeping this in mind, suppose we investigated 600. How many boys and girls are there in the United States under 21 years of age? 60,160,000. You think that's a pretty good test? How many are we getting? We're getting 6 out of every 601,600. Work that out in percentages. What percentage of the youth of the country are we testing? Now get this. I'm not finished yet. Of 1%. You see, I'm a rapid calculator. Did you ever hear about the rapid calculator? It was a man who was on a train. Somebody behind him said 648 cows as they passed by one field, 1,238 cows, 78 cows. The individual was curious. He said, how do you count them so fast with this train going this way? He said, I'm a rapid calculator. And he said, I count the legs, divide by 4. All right, if I investigated 600 cases out of the 60 million, I've only sampled 0.0000099% of the cases. How much is it worth? Nothing. Nothing from the point of view of reason. Remember, in 1936, the Literary Digest sampled 10 million people, and after sampling 10 million people as to how they would vote, they concluded that the electoral votes in November of that year would be 370 for Landon and 161 for Roosevelt. And they consulted 10 million. What do you suppose we're going to get if we consult 600 or 800? Did Landon become president? Anybody got an old Landon button just to remind us of these things? Now, another sample. Some years ago, Johns Hopkins University admitted women to the university. The following year, was reading in a work on statistics, figure was given out that 33 1/3% of the women who attended Johns Hopkins University married professors. That was marvelous opportunity for young women going to a university. they would have a choice of all of these learned men. All right, what are the laws of figures? 1, how many cases were possible? 2, how many were investigated? So we asked, how many students were there at Johns Hopkins? Women. 3, how many married a professor? 1. So if you want to think clearly, always find out how many cases were possible before you believe a statistic. Now, here's one statistic that you can take from me that is absolutely reliable, and it's worth remembering. 50% of all of the married people in the United States are women. The other 50 are men. Now, another way to think is never completely follow a mood. See, there are styles in thinking just as there are styles in women's clothes. I once saw a man running like mad with a hat box in his hand. I said, "What are you running for?" He says, "I'm trying to get the hat home before it gets out of style." Well, there are fashions in thinking, too. And the fashions in thinking are made by scientists. For example, we've had 3 styles. We had biology, was a very popular science at one time, and then physics, and then psychology. In 1859, when Darwin published his Origin of Species, not scientists now, but popularizers, lyricizers, romanticizers, those who felt that art and literature and everything else should dance to the tune "Pipe for It" by a science, made everything evolve. For example, Grant Allen wrote about the evolution of God, evolution of marriage by Westermarck, creative evolution by Bergson, which the whole cosmos was evolving. I used to attend lectures at the University of Paris. Bergson was there teaching, and he was very popular, you see, because he had romanticized this. It was the mood and fashion to talk of evolution in those days. And you had to go sit through a dull, stale, flat, unprofitable lecture on mathematics in order to save your seat for Bergson's lecture. And all of the fashionable dames of Paris and London were there. You'd find outside of the Collège de France, you'd find automobiles, Rolls-Royce, Chanard Walkers, Hispanis, Suiza, Renaults, and all the fine machines. I remember one day coming out of the class of Bergson, some English lady spoke to me. She says, "Wasn't that a wonderful lecture?" I said, "What did he say?" And so she told me something that he didn't say, and I spoke to her in French. She didn't understand a word of French, but Bergson was wonderful. So it was the fashion. Then that fashion died. Then when Einstein developed his theory of relativity, then we got a whole group of lyricizers here who said that everything is relative to space-time. And then we got relativity of morals, relativity of law. And then we got a new kind of literature in which we were constantly getting back to new beginnings. Remember Gertrude Stein, "A rose is a rose, is a rose, is a rose, is a rose." And Professor Alfred North Whitehead of Harvard said that God is a creature whose matrix is space-time. It was just a popular thing to do, to talk about space-time. And then that ceased to be popular, and then we got into the domain of psychology. And when Freud, as a scientist, published his work in which he developed the importance of the subconsciousness, which was indeed a great scientific contribution, there immediately cropped up here those who made everything dance to the tune of psychology. Then you got juvenile delinquency explained away as an Oedipus complex. God was called a father complex. Then you got a new style of literature. Notice today the short stories don't end, they just stop. There are no characters in literature like there were in the Victorian era, characters with an ethical simplicity like Micawber or Uriah Heep. They're disconnected, like pearls in the string the string of which is broken. And one is interested only today in the psychology of everything. That's because it happens to be a mood. Now, the point is this. One cannot take, and to think well, remember that you cannot take the methods and the conclusions of one science and apply them indiscriminately to another science. Each science has its own object, its own method, and it is entitled to that method. But you cannot take it, cannot take biology and apply it to engineering. You cannot take the subject of a sentence and apply it to another sentence. Take, for example, the sentence, this sentence here. Mathilde is artistic. And now take the sentence, the piggy, Porky, is fat enough to kill. Now, can you take the predicate artistic and apply it to this sentence here and say Porgy is artistic? Can you take this, Porgy is fat enough to kill, and apply it to Mathilde? Well, neither can you take the conclusions of one science simply because there's evolution of the biological order doesn't follow that God is evolving, that marriage is evolving, that everything else is evolving. When, for example, you have hurt the palm of your hand, you do not call in a florist. If you break the key in your door, you do not call in a piano tuner. Something happens to your windpipe, you don't call in a plumber. If you want to discover the authenticity of a Rembrandt, you don't call in the Lord Chancellor. He's a specialist in law, but he's not necessarily a specialist in art. And therefore, every particular science has its own domain, its own method. And a good thinker will not allow the methods and the categories and the theories to overflow into other domains. And furthermore, it's always a good thing to remember that if you marry the mood or the spirit of an age, you will be a widow in the next one. These fashions simply do not last. And it is not to be said that if one does not follow each of these fashions, that one is behind the times. No, one is behind the scenes. And sees that theories that were popular years ago will be forgotten in 10 or 15 years. But we've got to have some principles that do not change to live by. Who today knows Herbert Spencer? How many books of Herbert Spencer are taken out of the public libraries of the United States? Yet everybody read Spencer 50 years ago. Nobody knows him today. That's going to be true of the same ones who create the mood of this hour. Therefore, to think well, one has to have principles that are independent of space and time, by which one can live. We know that these principles exist, and we know there's such a thing as truth, simply because there's a logos, there's an intelligence behind the universe. One of the great thrills of thinking is to know all the sides, but also to know what is right and what is true. Why, it's a romance very much, as Chesterton says, like driving a chariot, 6 wild horses, driving them down a mountain lane road. And on either side of this mountain road, there's a ravine here, precipice here, chasm here, and a pit here. And the thrill of following truth is to drive those horses straight down that line. Oh, it's the easiest thing in all the world to be a rightist, for example, in politics. All you got to do is tumble over. The easiest thing in the world to be a leftist. Just fall over. Let go. It was the easiest thing in the world to be an Aryan in the 4th or 5th century. Easiest thing in the world to tumble into some mood today. Very easy to be a communist, just as simple as falling off a log. Very easy to be a Nazi. All you got to do is fall into the other side. And so the great romance of truth, therefore, consists in hewing to this straight line, knowing the pitfalls, and driving the horses of truth directly, and seeing all of these errors and moods, prostrate and fallen and forgotten, but driving ahead, reeling but erect. That's the romance of thinking. That's the joy of truth.
People of all faiths recognize Bishop Fulton J. Sheen as one of the greatest communicators of the 20th century. He was born in El Paso, Illinois, in May of 1896. As a young boy, he knew he wanted to be a priest. He served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Cathedral in Peoria, Illinois. At St. Viator College, his education and debating skills taught him the skills he used throughout his life. His unique ability at being natural and at ease in front of any audience was noted early in his ministry. He was ordained in 1919 and went on to become one of the best-known and greatly loved priests in church history. He wrote 96 books and hundreds of articles and columns. He broadcast numerous radio and TV programs. People from all faiths watched him on television because he spoke to every man. They always waited with joy for his goodbye, his blessing, God love you. It continues to give us joy and memories.
Bye now, and God love you.
Bishop Fulton J. Sheen went to be with the Lord in December of 1979. Fulton J. Sheen
consistently refused. This particular time, she was getting ready for a date, and her hands and face were smeared with cold cream. I came on television succeeding a show that she was looking at. She didn't want to smear the machine, so she had to leave me on. So she wrote and said, well, you did it. I finally came back to God, and I sent her a telegram. The telegram read, congratulations, a beautiful instance of how grace works through grease. We have to say something tonight about thinkers and professors. There was one mother who brought her little boy to a professor of psychology, and the professor said, we'll have to give him an aptitude test. She said, there's no need of that. He's apt to do anything. And some of the professors that we are going to talk about tonight, I wish that they all followed the example and the reminder of this particular one. He had to have an operation. He was prepared for the operation, finally wheeled into the operating room. Sterilizers were sizzling, instruments were gleaming, doctors and nurses were round about with their masks. Everything was prepared. Doctor standing over him, the sheet was finally pulled off of him, and he had written on his torso the word, think. Now, some of them think very well in certain moments, in certain subjects, and at other times not quite so well. I remember having dinners about a month apart with a group of professors. I was one for a quarter of a century in the university. The first dinner, we talked about science, the new nuclear physics, the new investigations. And it was edifying to see their love of research, their objectivity, their concern for truth, and the complete absence of a purely personal point of view. Sometime later, when we went to the second banquet, we discussed the subject of comparative religions. These same men, who seemed so objective, now allowed prejudices, points of view, narrowness, and even a certain amount of bigotry to creep in. Why was it that they were so objective when they were considering one field of knowledge and so narrow when considering another? It was because science did not concern them personally, but the other subject did. And hence they allowed their own feelings and perhaps their behavior and the way they lived to influence their attitude toward the second science. Now we're going to take 2 or 3 examples, as time permits, of thinking on this subject of comparative religions, men who should know better, and show you the kind of arguments that they use. Our first sample is H.L. Mencken. Mencken has written, "It is to be observed that the mothers of all of the prophets and men who claim to be messengers from God had names that began with an M. The mother of Buddha was Maya. The mother of Adonis was Maya. The mother of another was Mira, Batis. Now he said that explains the fact that the mother of our blessed Lord had devotion grow up to her because her name was Mary and it began with an M. Not very sound, is it? It reminded me when I was a boy, there was an old German that lived in our block, and I can remember asking him once, "What kind of an automobile do you have?" And he said, "Son," he said, "the 3 best automobiles in the world all began with a P, and I have one of them. The Peerless, the Packard, and the Buick." He had a Buick. Well, it was as sound as the argument of Mencken. Then take another great mathematical physicist, truly learned man, Alfred North Whitehead. Alfred North Whitehead said, "It was the custom once a year in the cult of Mithra for the king to enter into the temple and become intoxicated." Now I'm quoting Whitehead verbatim. Whitehead continues, "The awe at intoxication explains the use of wine in the communion service." Imagine. Can't see the difference between wine for intoxication, wine in a communion service. That man couldn't see the difference between a rope that's tied around a man to hold his pants up and another around his neck to hold his whole being up. Take another. This is so common. There's no point in using names. There's names from Germany, France, England, and America. Their argument is that all religions are due to a sun cult. The sun gods explain almost every religion under the sun. Apollo, for example, had a miraculous birth. Attis came from the lower regions. Osiris rose from the dead. Tammuz came out of the lower regions. And so anyone who's ever appeared and claimed to have given light to the world, such as, for example, the person of Christ, actually did nothing but develop a sun myth. That is why he had 12 apostles, because, they say, there were 12 signs in the zodiac. That's the argument. Now, let's run that down to earth. Just suppose we use the same argument on Napoleon. If you've ever seen the statue of Napoleon in Place Vendôme, Paris, you will notice that the word there of Napoleon is written the Apollio. Now that would mean, making this Greek, that means that he is Apollo itself. So there never really has been a Napoleon. It's all due to the sun cult of Apollo. You think you studied the history of Napoleon? Ridiculous. Who was his mother? Letizia, wasn't it? Who was the mother of Napoleon? Leto. What does Leto mean? In one language and Letizia in the other. Both joy. That's how we got the idea that Napoleon was born of a woman named Letizia from Apollo. You believe that Napoleon had 3 sisters? He did, according to a myth, but where did the myth start? Apollo had 3 sisters. Didn't Apollo have 2 wives? One was the earth, the other was the moon. Napoleon had 2. Where's the sun the major part of the day? How long is it in the sky? About 12 hours. How long did Napoleon reign supreme? 12 years. See, sun myth. He never existed. Furthermore, where is the sun strongest? In the north or the south? It's the south, isn't it? Gets weaker in the north, doesn't it? Where was Napoleon defeated? In Russia. See? Napoleon never existed. Sun cult. Think. Now here are 2 false assumptions that they use. One false assumption is that the primitive religion, whatever it is, equals the original religion. So if you want to know what religion is, you must go back through anthropology and study some very primitive manifestations of it. And all religion that has ever been in the world is nothing but a development of a primitive religion. Now that's not true. Religions not only evolve, they also devolve. Our blessed Lord said at the end of time that his church will be persecuted. Think you that when I come again I shall find faith on earth? It will not be an evolution, there will be a kind of a devolution in the sense of persecution. And furthermore, do we use this kind of an argument in any other kind of science? If we study medicine today, do we say we've got to go back to the witch doctors? Is astronomy today dependent upon astrology? And these same individuals will say, well, there are resemblances in all religions. Now, since there are resemblances in all religions, it follows that they're all due to imitation, plagiarism, and copy. Therefore, there's no religion that is divine. They're all human. Well, certainly there are resemblances, but is it not true by the mere fact that you say something is like another thing that you also say it's unlike that thing? Man is like a monkey, but a monkey isn't the same as a man. And then furthermore, the resemblances are very different in different wholes or contexts or categories or organisms. For example, sex is very different in an animal than in a man. Carbon is different in coal than it is in us. So too you can take certain things that happen, certain rites, liturgical practices in one religion, you'll find them in another, but they have an entirely different meaning in an entirely different context. Take, for example, not eating meat. Superficially, there doesn't seem to be any difference in religion between Moslemism, Judaism, and Christianity. But the motive is entirely different in the 3. And furthermore, it's not very sound to say that simply because there are resemblances, therefore they're all man-made. You go into an art gallery and you'll find exactly the same colors in all the paintings on the wall. Does that mean they were all painted by the same artist? We would not use that kind of logic. And then furthermore, Certainly there are certain resemblances, simply because man has certain basic tendencies and cravings which are very natural to him and would express themselves in a rather normal way throughout the entire world. Take, for example, the desire to worship. A man recognizes that he's unfit to exist before divinity, and so he will take an animal and kill it. He may take wine, pour it out. He may take wheat and burn it. He makes these things vicariously stand for himself. And then by destroying those things, he is practically saying, I am unworthy to exist in thy presence. What then is the proper attitude to take toward all world religions? Well, really the proper attitude to take is that there's something good in all of them. Perfect truth is really like a circle. You know, that's the only thing that I can draw well. See how good that is? Isn't it? I can't draw anything else. I'm proud of that. Now, truth is like that circle. It has 360 degrees. And that fullness would be found, for example, in the fullness of Christ's mystical body. Now, we are to think of every religion under the sun having something good. Maybe some religion that's started this afternoon in Los Angeles. That's got some good in it. May only have 10 degrees, but it's got some good. Buddhism, Confucianism, all the other world religions, they've all got good in them. Then you get to others, maybe they'll have something like 240 degrees of truth. Therefore, our attitude is not to be constantly pointing out the error, looking for the defects, seeking what is black, but rather laying hold of what is good. That's what St. Paul did, for example, when he was in Athens. He was talking to these people who were worshiping false gods, and he got hold of one statue that had the name unknown God in it, and he said, that's the God that I preach to you. Our blessed Lord meets a woman at the well. She's got 5 husbands. What is there in common between him and the woman with 5 husbands? He found it. It was a common love of a drink of cold water. With that, he started to build up the morals and the faith of the woman. And so, with world religions, everything is good. We can just as well start Christianity, start it with Buddhism and Confucianism as we started with Plato and Aristotle. Therefore, it should not be the business of those who wish to give a divine religion, for example, to Asia, to think they have to destroy everything. Start with what is good. Remember that what is true in them comes from God. What is erroneous comes from us. Now, another point is the transcendence of Christianity. How does Christianity differ from other world religions? It differs in this way. You know, my angel was out New Year's, and so I didn't have him come in tonight to change the blackboard. That's the reason I'm using it on this side all the time. I wished I had asked him to come in. Well, here is the difference. All man religions, human religions, operate this way. We start over again. Man to God. Man goes to God. How man goes to God may differ. He may go by contemplation. He may go by self-denial. He may go by mortification. He may go by putting himself in tune with the universe, by acceptance of the sovereign will of God. And those are the differences between Buddhism, Confucianism, the philosophy of Laozi, Tzu, and others, Hinduism. But in every instance, even in the psychological religions of the United States and humanism, man lifts himself by his own bootstraps, pulls himself by the lobes of his own ear. But what's Christianity? It's this way. God comes down to man. Man is weak. He needs a gift. How does anything rise except by someone higher than itself coming down to it? How do chemicals get into plants? How do plants get into animals? And how do plants and chemicals and animals get into us? We go down to them, we take them up, we change their nature. And so Christianity starts by God coming down to man and taking upon him, lifting man up to himself and giving him another nature so that he is no longer his own. Nature's completely changed. That's the difference between the two. And there's another difference. And that difference has to do with prehistory. See, when one investigates the subject of world religions, one can't immediately say, well, I'm going to choose Buddha, I'm going to choose Confucius, I'm going to choose Christ. We have reason. We're supposed to think. We don't start with faith. So we think out some ways of studying. Well, which one am I going to follow? Not only do we use our reason, we realize that we're in history. So we line them all up. Buddha, Confucius, Laozi, Tzu. Stand up there. I'm going to apply some tests. If you were a skygack from Mars, I would ask for your passport. You come claiming a message from God. How do I know it? You say, here I am, listen to me. Buddha, you say, here's my fourfold noble path, my eightfold way. Tzu, you say, here's my moral law, here's my Tao. Someone else says, here's a book, I got it from an angel. How do I know he got it from an angel? Why, any fool in the world can start. Say, here I am, believe me. You get a few followers, but they're not worth following. So reason and history has a test, and the test is, listen, did anybody know you were coming? If you came from God, the least that God could do would let us know that you were coming. So here's my test, and all of you pass it. And for the moment, Christ, you're no better than anyone else. Did any one of you know, or did the birth of any of you pre-announced, when you were coming, how you would die, what you would teach, in what country you would live? And finally, when you did come, was there such expectation that men would come from afar in order to see you? Can any of you step out of the line and say, yes, someone expected me? Only one can do it. That's Christ. That does not prove he's divine yet. That only proves that we'll study him because we've got a reasonable and historical background for doing it. And another difference between him and all other world religions is the fact that they all gave a method, a formula, a doctrine, a law. And they said, follow this method. Obey these rules, and you will live. Our Lord did not. He said, I am the truth. Truth was identified with this person because he was God. You cannot fall in love with the theorem of geometry. Virtue begins to be lovable only when it is incarnated in a person. And that was why he was the Savior of all men, and he said, if I be drawn up, I will draw all men to myself. And so when he came to die, he stripped himself of every individuating note in order that he might belong to all men. So all other religions are sunshine religions. They're all right for happy, prosperous days. But he brought the only religion in the world that began with defeat, with an ignominious failure, and therefore adversity. And he came out of it by resurrection because he was God. And that is why he's the only one that can ever give hope in trial. For as someone has put it, we have a God who stumbled to his throne.
Bishop Sheen will return in just a moment.
Fulton J. Sheen is indeed a man for all seasons. He walked a paced beat, allowing us to glimpse his nature and ponder its worth and to enjoy its presence. Bishop Sheen authored over 90 books. He broadcast countless radio and television programs and ministered in many parts of the world to people of every belief. As he said many times, it is not a unity of religion we plead for, but a unity of religious people. We may not be able to meet in the same pew, but we can meet on our knees.
The per capita expenditure on alcohol in the United States was $53 per head. That meant, even for every non-drinker and for every child, that $53 per head is $2 more per head than 1/4 of the world earns. Just think of it. Our liquor bill is more.
Friends, during this past week we received a very beautiful and lovely letter from a Presbyterian minister and his wife of Paulsboro, New Jersey. It concerned their little 4-year-old daughter named Becky. It seemed that Becky wanted to see a television show this particular week, and so the mother turned on first Bob Cummings. No, didn't want to see Bob Cummings. Then the mother turned on Groucho Marx. No, didn't want to see Groucho Marx. Well, who do you want to see? She said, I want to see that man that uses a chalk and blackboard and tells funny stories. So the mother turned me on for the 4-year-old Becky. What do you think I was talking about that night? Melancholy and sadness. Becky, forgive me. This telecast is dedicated to youth. Now, there are many ways of treating the subject of youth, just as there are many ways of treating the subject of elephants. For example, if a German wrote about elephants, he probably would write a book entitled The Elephant and Its Philosophical Significance in 3 volumes with footnotes. The Soviet would write on the elephant and the war against imperialism. An American would write a book entitled The Elephant and Its Byproducts. And the French would write a paper-covered booklet entitled The Elephant and His Loves. So we have to choose one particular way of talking about youth, and here we begin with the lighter side. But it will develop into something much more important and serious, and this has to do with 2 different characteristics of youth. Certainly, one of the characteristics of youth is vitality, and the other is the emergence of personality. First of all, vitality. That manifests itself in physical enthusiasm, even intellectual enthusiasm. Did you ever notice how much emotion, for example, youth puts into arguments? Sometimes it's to make up for a want of logic and a want of knowledge, but that difficulty does not belong just to youth alone. I know of someone in my profession, really and truly. His sermon was found on the pulpit Monday morning by the janitor, and he had written on the side of a typewritten sermon, "Argument weak, shout like the deuce." So in addition to enthusiasm, there's also that which is so popularly associated with them called sex. This particular time, the girl no longer is interested in playing games. She now curls up with a romance. She begins to dream. She hears of the marriage of someone else. She projects herself into that marriage. And the boy begins to be conscious, too, of his maleness and the sense of his own incompleteness. He feels that he has to shave. He has a choice of buying the light Gillette for light beards, the medium Gillette for medium beards, and the heavy Gillette for heavy beards. He buys the heavy one. And then, in addition to this, there is, of course, the love of movement. Speed, not particular interest in where they are going, but certainly they are on their way. And the like to fracture time. We got in at 4 o'clock this morning. We had our breakfast in the diner out in the country. And music, well, there are music. Music, I think, appeals to 4 different parts of the human anatomy. For example, there's capital music that appeals to the head, which might be the music of Bach. Then there's the music, cordial music, that appeals to the heart, such as that of Chrysler. And then there's the music that might be called visceral. And then finally there's then there's pedal music, moves the feet. Well, youth is principally interested in the pedal and visceral music, only later on it gets up to the heart and to the head. Well, in addition to these expressions of vitality, there is also the emergence of personality. The youth now begins to feel that he's no longer part of a herd and part of a family. Incidentally, youth very often at this age shows his worst side at home and his best side away from home. His worst side at home because he has to fight for the emergence of his personality in order to convince his parents that he's no longer a baby. Begins to call the father the old man. The mother, she says she no longer can understand her daughter. And then in addition to that, there's much daydreaming. Scripture says that the young men dream dreams, the old men see visions. The young look forward, the old look backwards. Laudator temporis acti, said Horace of the old. That which is past is always the best. But this looking forward to youth is his personality, life's work, vocation. It's good and it's right. But of course, youth must remember that youth is the morning and age is the evening of life. Those who have had the evening have already had the morning, but those who have had the morning had not yet had the evening. You think your parents are behind the times. Remember, that's what your parents told their parents, and someday somebody's going to tell you you're behind the times. Now, these are 2 different aspects of youth, but it is possible now to regulate youth in different ways. For example, one can regulate youth and life on the basis of what might be called the pleasure principle, as Freud called it. Or one can, taking this other aspect of youth, regulate life on the basis of character. Those who develop their lives solely on the basis of pleasure say, the only reason we're here is to have a good time. Get as much fun out of life as you possibly can. Those who start with this principle are concerned with values, with goals, with destinies, and why we're living. This is the answer to the question, what then? The young man is told, he's asked, what are you going to be? I'm going to be a doctor. What then? I'm going to begin to practice. What then? I'm going to marry. What then? I'm going to raise a family. What then? I'm going to make money and retire at 78. What then? It's that last what then we have to start with. Now, are these 2 different principles contradictory? No. But suppose, however, one starts with the pleasure principle. What happens? The development of character loses its urgency. If youth starts with the idea that we are here in this world solely to have a good time, there is danger that the giving away to the emotions, to sentiments, the lower part of our being, will begin to cloud our reason. We lose the capacity to think clearly because we are influenced by the way we live. A robber has to defend his philosophy of robbery, his robberies. Murder is crime.
And after a while, there begins to be an adjustment to our behavior. And the result is that there may develop skepticism and doubt. Youth may even become atheistic. These are not intellectual positions, and let no educators believe that they are. They are just simply moral positions. They result from behavior. And then, too, one of the dangers of this pleasure principle is the pleasures are going to decrease as time goes on. Suppose I had the habit of, when I was talking to you, of just doing that. Well, you would say after the first 178 broadcasts, isn't that a strange habit that he has? And then if I were to impress you with the next 178 telecasts, I would have to do something like this. And then when we got into 400, I would have to do like this. So we lose the capacity for enjoyment as time goes on. And then we begin to suffer ennui and boredom and feel that life is not worth living. That's one of the grave dangers of starting with the pleasure principle. And it's rather difficult when youth starts with that to ever rationalize them and reason them away from it, because they justify giving way to their emotions. I believe that one of the best approaches that has been developed was by a professor of philosophy at the University of Cambridge, C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book that went through 25 editions in 5 years called Screwtape Letters. Read it. It's a marvelous book. It's a series of correspondence or letters that were exchanged between an old uncle devil in hell, whose name is Screwtape, S-C-R-E-W-T-A-P-E, and his younger nephew devil on earth, whose name is Wormwood. Wormwood is working on the soul of a young man. He's trying to win him over through the diabolical ways of living. And in this correspondence, the wiser old devil in hell counsels Wormwood as to how he is approached to win over this youth. Every now and then there enters into the correspondence a warning from Screwtape about the enemy, and to beware of the tactics of the enemy. The enemy, of course, is God. As a result, in this work, you get a great deal of spiritual advice upside down, because it's always the devil that's telling you what to do, and you're surprised when you read the book as how often you follow the devil's advice. For example, at the very beginning of the book, Screwtape gets after Wormwood. He says, "Wormwood, you're a fool. You are trying to convince this youth that materialism is right and true. You are even attempting to prove that materialism is true." Screwtape says, "Wormwood, never do that. Remember that proof belongs to the enemy. Remember that it is the enemy who speaks of a thing being true. When you deal with youth, never, never argue about true and false. All that you must do when you talk to youth is get him to ask, is it modern? Is it progressive? Make him fearful that it's reactionary, or maybe it's medieval, and he will steer away from the idea, but never speak of truth." Then he says, get the youth to read cheap poets and fifth-rate novelists. And then he'll grow up with the idea that all kinds of repression are wrong, that marriage was never meant to be one and enduring. And finally, Wormwood's not doing too well with the young man. And eventually he gets on the subject of sex. And old Screwtape said, "Wormwood," he said, "we change styles of sex. Centuries go on." He said a few centuries ago, he said, we created the mode, the particular type of woman that was desirable was the statuesque, aristocratic type.
Now, Screwtape says we've left the age of waltz. We are now in the age of jazz. And the woman now whom we idolize is the woman who very closely resembles a boy in looks. She's very thin. One of the great advantages of this is we make her fearful of growing old. And then she's also the type that cannot bear children. That helps us very much. And finally, old Screwtape gives the last counsel, and he says, cultivate noise. He said there is not an inch of infernal space. There is not a moment of infernal time that is not filled with noise. We have to have noise in order to drown out all of our dismal worries and anxieties and fears. And he said on earth they must have noise too, noise to drown out the melodies and the silences of heaven. And we do not yet have enough noise on earth. I am almost in despair. It's a great spiritual book for youth. It will warn them of the danger of the primacy of the pleasure principle. Now suppose you start with the other principle. Suppose you start with the character principle. Then you begin with discovering the purpose of life. There has never been a system of education, and there will never be a system of education equal to that, which takes a child 4 or 5 or 6 years of age and turns him into an Aristotle or a Plato and makes him answer at the very beginning of life the question, why were you made? And there are millions of children in this world who are answering that question with, I was made to be happy. And the way to be happy is to know truth and to love goodness and to seek a life that is enduring and eternal. In other words, I am made for God in the fullness of His revelation and all that is. When a youth starts with that plan of life, then everything else fits into place. The biological, the economic, the social, and pleasure. Then the youth begins to understand these instincts. Certainly a youth has great passions and emotions, and they are right, and they are good. And let no one ever say that they are evil, because they are divinely implanted. Almighty God has put into every youth in the world 2 great hungers. One, a hunger for food, and the other, the hunger for a mate. And God implanted these impulses and hungers simply because, first, individual life had to be preserved by eating, and secondly, social life had to be preserved, humanity, by birth and by generation. And Almighty God, in order to ensure the preservation of individual life and the preservation of social life, associated great and intense pleasures with both of these impulses, in order to be sure that the ends of man would be achieved. Let no one therefore ever tell you, and we say these instincts are wrong. They are not wrong. They are not wrong any more than the instinct for play is wrong, or the instinct for pleasure, or the instinct for happiness. What is wrong is to say, well, we have these impulses, and we must follow our nature, must we not? Yes, we must follow our nature. But our nature is not the nature of a pig. Pig will use certain instincts according to season and laws implanted by nature. But we are to use these instincts according to reason and according to will and according to the final purpose of life. When youth understands that, then he will not fall prey to a very false doctrine which is upsetting youth and upsetting the world. namely believing that man is to be understood in terms of sex. He is not. Sex is to be understood in terms of man. You might just as well say to you, my voice is to be understood in terms of the larynx. There's something else in my voice and the words that come out than the larynx. And so sex is associated with love and is related to the whole personality. When youth understands this, the final goal of living, then he takes these God-given pleasures and enjoys them in the way that God intended. Then his life is normal. Then he's not suffering from ennui and suffering from boredom, beginning to feel that life is something at which we may sneer. If youth today is protesting against the older generation, it's not because the youth is wrong, it's because the older generation has not given him that culture and those principles which youth needs and which youth believes that it should have. Why should we always, when we think of youth, immediately begin talking about juvenile delinquency? Why is it that we always pick the worst that youth shows instead of the best? When we study art, do we look at the crudest manifestations of art? Or when we study music, the babblings of a child, do we not always look to the best? Why is it that immediately juvenile delinquency comes to our mind when we speak of youth, if it is not because crime makes better news than virtue? And why does crime make better news than virtue? Because a civilization that has a sense of guilt, even though it be unconscious, likes to read about how wicked other people are. It makes them feel more innocent. Why not look to the best that is in youth? What is the best? I will tell you what's the best in youth. And this is the reason of hope for youth. Every year, there are tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of youths who give themselves completely and totally to God.